Okay, welcome friends. Are we good? Can you hear me? Excellent, excellent. I hope you're enjoying a healthy, happy, and joyous day filled with love and laughter. Wouldn't that be great? Every day, every day. I want to start, as usual, as always, thanking you for my email this week. I really appreciate it when you write to me, and I was happy to receive many kind comments suggesting that last week's call encouraged you to actually step back and think about the basics, because those basics of our training, as we described last week, offer a kind of skillful means by which each and every one of us can continue to polish our mirror in ways that encourage calmness under stress and the practice of non-dissension in our daily life. And so I'd like to remind you now, as I did with the various people who were writing to me suggesting these things, I want to say, you know, we always have a choice how we respond to adversity or a lack of fairness, whether it's perceived or real. And this is really important. Why? Because we're in the soup, remember? We're in the soup. Remember, when we begin to taste through your training, breathing, meditation, daily life, when you begin to taste this idea of a universal mind, you begin to experience the depth, the real depth, the obvious depth of your interconnection with all things. And so I want to remind you, we're actually empty of a separate self. That's a myth. If we were separate, we couldn't live. Our blood wouldn't flow. We couldn't breathe. So if you think of it, it's so obvious, but yet we have a filter related to self-identity where we forget. And when you start to experience the depth of this connected self, that's a huge responsibility, because now you recognize there's no escape, right? You can't hide. You can't wait for the next guy to change. You can't even be neutral, because being neutral is an action which is not acting. So what do you do with that? Well, I'm going to ask you to meditate on this. I'm just going to tee up a concept here, and then I'll move on and focus on John. Look, chapter 1, we talked last week, reisation, uchu-reisei. That's the art of preparation in living with the wind at your back. And that naturally leads, as Toi Sensei taught, to banyu aigo. Loving all creation is the logical causal result of recognizing your universal mind. Well, it doesn't end there, right? You're now in the soup. So the third chapter and the third art is the art of responsibility, because there's no escape. You are responsible for your role in the soup that we all share. So I'd like you to think about both logically and experientially. Why is it necessarily the case that the art of responsibility has to follow the first two? So that's just kind of a koan for you for another time. Before I introduce Poppele Sensei, I want to say that I've really enjoyed my communications with John this week, as he has been preparing, and he's been preparing a lot, to discuss very openly and honestly this unfolding of his Tenshoku. And I'm going to say I selfishly enjoyed it because it forced me to think about myself and my Tenshoku, and it didn't unfold at all. Toi Sensei told me, he said, here's your Tenshoku. But it was more like a father trying to maybe scold or properly lead his son. Because remember, Toi Sensei was not interested in his studies at Keio University in the Department of Economics. He was interested in personal development. He was heavily involved in Zen and Misogi. But his dad said, you got to finish what you start. You know, I'm holding you accountable and responsible. You have to finish. So there I was living as Uchideshi in Japan saying, Sensei, I'm so happy. This is exactly what I want to do. You know, this is great. I just want to be an Aikido professional. So maybe I don't need to finish my doctorate. Wrong. No. He was like a lecture. You'll be a doctor of ki. Doctor of ki. I'm telling you, doctor of ki. I'm like, and he'd say, I'm never going to be Dr. Tohei, but if you get credentialed in this way and you're writing your dissertation about ki and Japanese philosophy and all this Buddhist stuff, he was like, you have to finish. But I can honestly say that's not me accepting my Tenshoku. That was just like a shocker, like, okay, I got to finish. It took decades for me to actually own the idea that maybe I had something to share that was unique because of my own life experience with Toi Sensei, sharing so much of the things I've been sharing with you. Well, the beautiful thing about all this is we all have really radically different life experiences, you know, gender, culture, race, where we grew up, who our parents were, what kind of religion we were taught as children, what kind of biases and prejudices, whether we knew them or not, were being shared with us in our developmental years. So that's why I love these calls again, because we're turning lemons into lemonade, taking the time to talk about subjects more deeply that we normally don't have time to do, but we get to really get to know one another. I realize there's limits, but we're getting to know when a speaker signs up and they're like going to do something, they really prepare, and I want to thank everyone for doing that because they have an opportunity to share more deeply their story. And that helps all of us because we're all different. You don't want to hear from me all the time. Let's hear from each other and recognize we all have these gifts and we're all applying these key principles. And the fact that we can share them and maybe encourage each other and stimulate each other or think about things in new ways, I think is a really great use of our time. And so anyway, I just want to thank all of you for that. All right, John, I'll be done. I'm done now. I'm going to tee you up, but I have a lot to say because he's one of my heroes. All right, here's the short one-sentence version is Poppele Sensei works to help people connect more deeply to themselves, to each other, and to nature. He has over 3 decades of experience in movement arts, meditation, and mind and body practices, and he's going to share that with us in some depth, and I'm really looking forward to that. He is a Yondan, 4th degree black belt, Chuden in Shinshin Totsudo, and he's the head instructor of Minnesota Ki Aikido. Poppele Sensei was first introduced to Ki Aikido by his brother, who was actually training in Albuquerque, the Albuquerque Ki Society in New Mexico. And it was kind of like just walking in and I guess being the friend, in this case it was the brother, and he got a taste. And then when he moved to Minnesota, or when he was able to start, I think in earnest, he said in 1996. So that was 24 years ago, he began training like very intensively, nonstop. I met John in 2003 in the fall, just before I guess it was January 1st that the Eastern Ki Federation was started by Toi Sensei. And really in those first years, John was everywhere. Wherever I went, John was there. I mean, it was like 10, 12 seminars a year. He's been to Japan 5 times. He's competed in 2 Taigi competitions. He's gone to Russia with me more than anybody else, 3 times. That's a record. So he's just incredible because he's just hungry and always has been, and he's just so sincere. All right, well, that's going to come through. But now let me just talk about all the different hats this guy wears. It's incredible. So he's an author. 10 books, 10 nature guidebooks primarily on stargazing and wildlife tracking. He created what's referred to as Nature's Wild Card series. These are actually like playing cards, decks of cards that are educational in nature. He started that series for adventure publications. Get this, he sold over 500,000 lifetime sales, including 200,000 books. Hello. Like when you're an academic, nobody sells 200,000 books. Anyway, and 300,000 decks of cards. So incredibly successful. Not only that, he's been acknowledged. He received an honorable mention from the National Outdoor Book Awards, which, by the way, is the largest and most prestigious award program for nature guidebooks. How about this? John is a certified wildlife tracker. He founded the Minnesota Wildlife Tracking Project in 2014, where he continues to serve as the director. This organization has partnerships with the University of Minnesota, the National Park Service, and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. He is a popular speaker for wildlife tracking organizations, and he gives over a dozen presentations a year to various audiences. His education, he received a Bachelor of Science from the University of Minnesota, majoring in ecology, evolution, and behavior, with a minor in philosophy. Just cheerleading, that's okay. He also has a master's degree in science and from the University of Minnesota in conservation biology. And not only that, but ABD, that means all but dissertation. So that means beyond the master's, he actually completed his doctoral field exams as well. So very advanced. He taught undergraduates biology, ecology, and the freshman composition courses, also at the University of Minnesota, helping him to go through graduate school. He was a lecturer in the Department of Writing Studies for 6 years, where he taught technical and professional writing. And guess what? There's still 2 more categories. Hello. Number 1, bicycling. So are you guys familiar with that thing called a velodrome? It's like an oval track that's what do you call it, John? It's curved, right? So it's banked. So people are just flying around those things. Well, he was like a world-class sprinter, right? He was an Olympic trials competitor in 1992. He was a nationally ranked sprinter also in the 90s. And then, like Aikido maybe took over, but just last year in 2019, after a 23-year absence, he said, you know what? I think I'm gonna go back to the bike and call my friends and hang out with them. And it didn't take long where he won the Elite State Championship as the lead out rider in the team sprint. So that's like an event, right? And he's back. And finally, juggling. Did you know he was a professional entertainer? Yes, he was. And he was a finalist at the International Jugglers Association Senior Championships. And he's got an interesting story about that, having to do with neurophysiology and the brain and his father, right, John? Yeah, so we're gonna hear all about that. So I'll stop taking up his time and just say, I love this guy. And I'm really grateful that he's leading Minnesota. John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sensei. Thanks for that really kind introduction. Let me just pull up the slides here and get started. So after a bit of conversation about topics, Shaner Sensei and I landed on this for the discussion today: recognizing Tenshoku, finding clarity on an unexpected journey. In the second shokushu, Soshu Koichi Toi Sensei invites us to let us pledge to fulfill our missions by helping to guide the development and creation of the universe. And in the first chapter of Living with the Wind at Your Back, Shaner Sensei asks us the question, have you ever wondered why you're here? My answer to that is yes, often. And I'd like to share with you a bit about my journey in exploring that question as it's unfolded for me over the last 3 decades. And before I dive into that, I just want to make a couple of comments about this format and us gathering together here on the web and how we can use this platform to connect. Zoom is a little bit different than in-person gatherings, and I would like to extend an invitation to you, if you're on the live call, to please use the chat. And in fact, please have side conversations. Share your curiosities, your passion, your purpose. If I say something during this talk that reminds you of a friend who's on the call, drop them a note in the chat. Let them know you're thinking about them. If something strikes your curiosity, send something out in the chat to a friend, to one of your teachers, to one of your students, or to the whole group. But we can keep this a bit conversational. You can keep this conversational as I'm going through and presenting. If you're watching this as a recording, please feel free to engage in the comments. Share your own stories, your questions, your reflections in the comments, and I'll do my best to stay engaged on the recording as well. And you can also write to me and we can continue a conversation. You can write to me at the Minnesota Ki Aikido, www.mindbodyoneness.com, and we'll have that link in the below the recording as well. So with that, I'm going to jump to the very end before backing up and telling you about my story. I'm going to jump to the end and share with you my Tenshoku as I understand it today. The way I see my life purpose today, to practice and freely share arts and principles that help myself and others to connect more deeply with ourselves, with others, and with the natural world, supporting us in deepening our recognition of our own true nature and growing increasingly at ease in our own being. I'm going to back up for you now to the early 1990s and share with you my journey about recognizing this and the way that it's influenced my life. The preface, Living with Depression. I never graduated from high school. You could say I dropped out, you could say I failed out, one way or another, I didn't complete high school. I began attending college as a non-degree seeking student and sort of stumbled along in that way for a number of years. At this time, in my late teens and early 20s, I had a basic view of myself as not talented, not athletic, and not particularly smart. And a sense of myself as isolated and separate, fundamentally deficient, and unchanging. In fact, that view of myself, you could say, was exactly opposite to Poppele Sensei's principles of the universe. And even here, in this condition, were the seeds of what I would later recognize as my Tenshoku. There was something there about being drawn to teaching, interested in nature, and interested in interconnection. At the time, the one thing that I could understand that put those together would be being a professor of ecology. And so in my stumbling through college, I moved in that direction towards studying ecology. Learning to train, college, cycling, and juggling. I struggled in college until I took my first class in ecology, and that class really lit me up. It was interesting, it was rigorous, and I discovered I had a knack for it. I also discovered philosophy and epistemology. My introduction to philosophy was studying philosophy of science. Just a little tip, if you want to become a scientist, don't study too much philosophy of science. But it was a really, really rich experience for me. At the same time as I was stumbling through my first few years of college, I was getting involved in bicycle racing.
These images are from some of my early races. The bottom picture here was the first race that I ever won as a licensed bike racer, which was the only race that I did as a junior before I moved into the regular senior ranks. Winning in a field sprint against two elite juniors who had recently returned from the junior national championships. And it was my first indication that this was something that I could lean into, that this was something where I could find some success. Bicycle racing was really a practice of intense physical training and very uncomfortable, intense physical training. And what I learned right away was that the physical pain of training was a lot easier for me to deal with than the emotional pain that I experienced in a lot of my day-to-day life. And the physical discomfort of training was something that I could control. So I had this physical pain that I could control that put at bay some of the emotional pain that I felt I couldn't control. So needless to say, I spent a lot of time on my bike. I was also at this time learning juggling. Juggling was something that was fun, it was interesting, it was social, and I was practicing about 20 hours a week, often when I was supposed to be in class. So I'm calling this section Learning to Train. When Soshi Tohei was a young man and beginning at university, he describes learning how to train from Poppele Sensei when he began training at Ichiku Kai. I can't call this section Learning How to Train because I was learning something much, much more fundamental than what Soshi Tohei was learning. I was really learning that training was something that was possible. So continuing, learning to train, college, cycling, and juggling. Success in academics, cycling, and juggling began to very slowly challenge and shift my worldview. First of all, it had me recognize that I had a worldview, that my opinions about myself, my views of the world, my sense of separation was a view. So an early insight was to begin to recognize that my experience of depression was something that was in my mind, that I had a worldview and that it was a negative one. And I recognized that if this was something in my mind, that there was a path through this, also through the mind. Now, it would take me a long time before I recognized that in my mind didn't mean an intellectual path. And I spent a long, long time trying to figure out my way out of depression. I'd be happy to tell you over a beer sometime how that went. My first lesson in training was a really fundamental one. And this was a lesson I learned mostly from juggling. I learned that I could improve with practice. And yes, it really did take me until my early 20s to realize that it was possible to improve with practice. So I was going and spending time juggling. I was taking classes in epistemology, studying about the philosophy of learning and what knowledge, the nature of knowledge and what it meant to know. And then I was coming home and I was living at home while I was in college, and I would sit down over the dinner table with my father, who's a neuroscientist. And we would have conversations about what was happening in my spinal cord and in my brain as I was practicing these juggling movements, and how my perception was changing, how my worldview would actually change, the way in which my eyes and body were wired together, the way in which I perceived the world was mutable and was being affected through my training. And so this was a lesson that I learned from my dad, from studying philosophy, and from the practice of going out and learning complicated juggling patterns and seeing this change. And I came to have a very simple view of training. I came to think of training at its core as simply intention and attention, setting a course and paying attention to what happens. Next chapter, a reductionist goes searching, running away to join the circus. I completed my degree in ecology, and as Shaner Sensei has shared the Wordsworth quote, "Here too in ecology, we murder to dissect." And fundamentally, I was looking for connection, not for dissection. So I was looking for a different direction to go with my exploration, with my studies. At the same time, I was drifting away from bike racing. I was coming to recognize that I wasn't going to improve very much without tremendous effort. And at this time in my life, I didn't see the long-term value of stable practice. My attitude was up or out, and I wasn't going up, so I was out, and I quit the sport. Instead, I became a professional entertainer, and I did it because it was fun. That was all I was up to, was doing something that I was having a good time at, and that would put food on the table. But it was interesting to look back years later and see that this time as an entertainer was preparing me in some very key ways. I was learning how to be comfortable in front of a group. I was learning how to connect in front of a group. I was also learning how to bring other people up in front of a group and work with them and have them feel comfortable and at ease, and how to learn things in front of other people. These were all skills that turned out to be tremendously valuable later on when I was teaching Aikido, when I was teaching in the university classroom. It wasn't what I set out to do, but my time as an entertainer, I think, made me a much better instructor. Kaicho Tohei Sensei writes about a story when he went to Soshu Tohei and asked his father how he could become a better public speaker. And Soshu Tohei's response was, go to the yosei, which is the traditional Japanese comedy theater. And Kaicho Sensei writes about his lessons of going to the yosei and learning about timing and rhythm and connection and pause and how to be an effective public speaker through that. So this was my version of going to the yosei. Reductionist goes searching, new practices and a sense of connection. Through this same time in the late 90s, I was getting introduced to pop spirituality and self-improvement, learning different types of meditation, journaling, and reflection. And I was also introduced to Ki Aikido. As Shaner Sensei mentioned, my first Ki Aikido classes were in 1994 with Steve Murley Sensei at the Albuquerque Ki Society. And I began what we'll tentatively call regular Aikido practice, a more consistent Aikido practice, in the beginning of 1996 with Jerry Kelly Sensei at Minnesota Ki Aikido. And I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I just enjoyed jumping around. But I must have suspected that there was something a little more to it, because I lived down the street from an Aikikai dojo, and I was driving across town and into the suburbs to attend the Ki Society classes with a new Shodan as an instructor. So there was something there that was pulling at me and tugging at me. It would be a long time before I understood what it was. This was also when I was first introduced to wildlife tracking. Once again, I had no idea what it really was, but the feeling of connecting to nature was resonating with me. And so it was something that I took a growing interest in. I also was exposed to energy healing at this time and trained as a healing touch practitioner. Recognized that wasn't something I wanted to hang out a shingle and do in a professional capacity, but it did help me recognize that well-being and helping people was deeply important to me, and that in some way that was part of what I wanted to be up to with my life. Next chapter, a false start, returning to school. Sort of. With this growing but still vague sense of purpose related to teaching, related to nature, well-being, positive human relations, I recognized that juggling was fun, but not the vehicle I wanted. And so I returned to school looking for a program with rigor and vision that was about supporting healthy human-nature connection at a personal level, in terms of personal well-being, and also at a societal level, environmentalism. At the time, the University of Minnesota was beginning a new master's program in environmental learning and leadership that on paper sounded like exactly what I was looking for. The first day, I almost dropped out. I stuck it through the first semester before recognizing at the beginning of the next term that this was not a program of rigor and vision and was not about what I was looking for. But I was on the books as a grad student, and at this time I'd found myself a teaching assistant position that was paying tuition and paying my bills. So I dropped all my classes and became what I called a freelance graduate student. I spent about 2 years taking classes in whatever it was that was interesting me, teaching biology and earth science labs, before I started to get a little bit restless and really looked for more of a sense of direction. But it was a fun time. I was taking classes in modern dance, sociology, anthropology of social movements, aesthetics, epistemology, just a wide range of stuff that no advisor would ever have approved of as a course program. I see my academic friends laughing. New Foundation, Conservation Biology Graduate Program. After a couple of years, I found a home in the Conservation Biology Graduate Program at the University of Minnesota. It was a program that would let me explore my pretty eclectic interests, as long as it seemed to fall under this broad banner of conservation. I ended up in that program studying conflict management and mediation, got a graduate minor in conflict management, became a community mediator, spent about 7 years doing community mediation with the Minneapolis Mediation Program, the Dispute Resolution Center in St. Paul, did a lot of neighbor mediation, court-based mediation, all kinds of things. In school, I was focusing primarily on my roles as a teacher. After a couple of years of teaching, being a teaching assistant in labs, I was looking for something more engaging, and I got a job teaching freshman composition in the English department. Now, the reason that I never graduated from high school was because I didn't have enough English credits. And I took exactly one composition class in college. So it was kind of an interesting sell walking in and explaining that I wanted to teach freshman writing at the university level. But I told the director of the program I was a good teacher, I was a good writer, and I was willing to do what it took to learn how to be a good teacher of writing. And he bought it. So I started teaching freshman composition in a course that was specifically themed around nature and the environment, which was my toe in the door. Also during this time, I had an opportunity to teach an undergraduate level course in ecology. And so at that point in my graduate training, I was doing exactly what I would be doing if I were to become a professor in ecology. I was teaching undergraduate ecology, I was doing my own research, and I enjoyed it, but recognized that it wasn't what I wanted to be doing with my life. It took me 10 years after that insight to finally leave the university. As there's a theme through this whole presentation that I'm a bit slow on the uptake. At the same time, my research questions for my studies remained ill-defined and ill-advised. And I mean ill-advised in every sense of that term as an academic. So after a number of years, I ended up completing with a master's degree. I did my master's thesis on wildlife tracking as a vehicle for healthy relationships between people and nature. It was primarily a work in environmental philosophy. And it would end up being many, many years before I implemented those ideas and came to realize that the project that I wanted to do would take me more than a lifetime. New foundations immersing in wildlife tracking. While I was in graduate school, I began to participate in tracking programs from Wilderness Awareness School and the Shikari Tracking Guild. I participated in annual wolf tracking expeditions in Idaho that were large citizen science projects focused on tracking the growing wolf population in that state after reintroduction. I did a summer-long internship with John Young, who was my tracking mentor, and Mark Elbrock, who is the foremost tracking expert in North America. During this time, I had an opportunity to see the positive impact that wildlife tracking as a practice was having on people. I was seeing people coming out of these programs who had healthy minds, healthy connections, a deep respect for nature. I also had a lot of really interesting conversations with John Young, my tracking mentor. He gave a lot of attention to life purpose and people recognizing their life purpose. And his approach to supporting people in recognizing life purpose was to cultivate curiosity. And John would say, curiosity leads to passion, and passion leads to purpose. And through this time, my curiosity about tracking was definitely becoming a passion. And there was also a spark lit at this time, which was that I wanted to write nature guidebooks. At the time, I didn't think that was something accessible to me. Roger Tory Peterson writes nature guidebooks. John Poppele reads nature guidebooks. It was just sort of the way in which the world was organized, and I was cool with that. So after stumbling around a little bit, I came up with an idea of creating some decks of playing cards as a resource for people to help become more familiar with the natural world around them. And I'll pick up that story in a little while. New Foundations dedicating to Aikido, my first seminar. Also at this time, I was deeply immersing myself in Aikido. My first Aikido seminar was with Kashiwaya Sensei. It was in the September of 2001. I had just tested for 3rd Kyu. So I'd been training, depending on when you start the clock, since either 1996 or 1994. So after somewhere between 5.5 and 7.5 years, I had just earned my 3rd Kyu. I was not on the fast track. So you see this picture here. It's me standing next to Bill Deuser, who I trained at the Minnesota Ki Aikido together with, Kashiwaya Sensei. And then on the left there, Patrick Terry Sensei. Patrick Terry Sensei was a Nidan at the time. And until I arrived in Kansas City for the Kashiwaya Sensei seminar, was the most senior Aikido practitioner I had ever seen. I was a bit taken aback when I met Kashiwaya Sensei. My reaction when my brother asked me how I liked the seminar when I got home, I said, oh, so that's what we're practicing. I still had no clue, but for the first time, I realized that I had no clue. And I felt a growing drive to understand. My curiosity about Aikido was turning into passion. 2 years later, at that same dojo in Kansas City, Kashiwaya Sensei and Vic Montgomery Sensei oversaw my Shodan test. 1 month later, I met Shaner Sensei. The following year, Minnesota Ki Aikido joined the newly formed Eastern Ki Federation. New Foundations, dedicating to Ki Aikido, World Camp, and Taigi. In 2004, I attended World Camp for the first time and participated in the Taigi competition with Matt Dirch-Kidder at Shaner Sensei's invitation. Having an opportunity to work with the best teachers in the world and having unexpected, to say the least, success in the Taigi competition transformed my view of Aikido, my relationship to it, and what could be possible. I saw, really for the first time very clearly, that I had an unconscious view of myself, that I knew that I really could never be any good at this. I wasn't Japanese. I hadn't begun as a child. I had no innate talent for it. And so where I could go with this art was severely limited. And this was a view that I recognized that I had not just about Aikido, but about tracking, about writing, about many of the other things that interested me. And in seeing this, that view began to unravel, not just in Aikido, but all over my life. About a year later, I bumped into Vic Montgomery Sensei at National Seminar. And he came up to me and completely unprompted, he said, "It's good to see you, John. It looks like you've finally given yourself permission to be good at this." New Foundations, dedicating to Ki Aikido, traveled to Russia. I made 3 trips to Russia with Shaner Sensei. I think the title was Otomo, but I was pretty clueless. And if anything was happening there, he was otomoing me. With a new teacher, meeting new friends, having a new sense of possibility, I was wide-eyed and basically clueless. But I did, on those trips, have a chance to see how universal our principles really are. I saw them completely, these universal principles that transcended culture, that transcended language, that transcended relatedness. And I began to feel that this art could be part of my life's purpose. On my second trip to Russia, Igor Osterumov Sensei, who's seen in this picture throwing me with a shihonage, arranged for a visit to the Summer Palace for our group. And walking through the grounds of the Summer Palace with Shainer Sensei, I shared with him this growing feeling that practicing this art and sharing this art could be part of what I was up to with my life. And I said to Shainer Sensei, you know, I'm interested in doing this, but maybe I'll always feel this way. But I just have this sense that there are certain really fundamental things about this art that I do not understand at all. And that until I have at least a basic understanding of them, I have absolutely no business putting myself out there as a professional instructor. And Shainer Sensei turned to me and said, yep, you'll always feel that way. And I recognized that that was the end of the conversation. New foundations, tools for recognizing purpose. As I trained in Aikido, I was beginning to learn to feel alignment through the practice. What does a bump feel like? What does it feel like to move freely? When am I in alignment with my partner? And by extension, when am I in alignment with Tenshoku? When is what I'm doing in my life feel like an Aikido technique that's working? When is what am I doing in my life feel like an Aikido technique that's a struggle, that's colliding? Maybe I could make it work, but it's not really in alignment. I'm not really moving together. In 2008, Christopher Curtis Sensei led the Eastern Ki Federation Shugo Taisai Kigan Shiki seminar at the Merrifield Dojo. There's a wonderful write-up about the seminar in the Eastern Ki Federation Ohana newsletter, volume 2, number 1. And I'm going to ask Matt Atarian to put a link to that in the talk description. Also in that newsletter, Steve Zimmerman Sensei, in his Ki in Aikido in Business column, wrote about one of the things that Curtis Sensei shared, the distinction of purpose versus goal. Curtis Sensei shared with us how important it is to focus on purpose, on why we're doing something, rather than on the goal, what we're doing. And how the underlying, if often we focus on goals, and those goals can support our purpose, but we can also get distracted by goals and have them pull away from our purpose. So with this sense of distinction between purpose and goal, this growing feeling of alignment I was gaining through Ki Aikido, and I also did a series of training with an organization called Landmark Education. Seminars that support people in identifying and navigating internal blocks and creating and fulfilling on intentions. And with this recognition of the distinction of purpose versus goal, I focused on intentions of purpose. Why was I doing what I was doing? An unexpected career, opening the dojo and teaching Ki Aikido. The Center for Mind-Body Oneness, the home of the Minnesota Ki Society, opened in June of 2006. It was clear to me that I had found my calling, but not my job. I was teaching 15 hours a week, traveling to 12 seminars a year, absolutely loved it, and crystal clear I did not want to make it my job, and I needed a job. So because it was literally the only job I could find, I returned to the university to teach technical and professional writing. I enjoyed teaching at the university. I enjoyed teaching. But teaching as an adjunct is a low-paying, dead-end job and not a career path. Unexpected career. A deck of cards becomes a career. When I'd been training as a tracker, I had this idea that I wanted to write field guides. Instead, I designed a deck of playing cards. Seemed like something I could do. This deck of playing cards was set up to help people learn constellations. I'm more familiar with the night sky. Looking for a publisher, I was offered a book contract instead. This offer, at one and the same time, felt like it came completely out of the blue and was exactly what I had spent the last 10 years preparing for. I poured all of my ideas about nature connection into writing that guidebook. My publisher later told me that it was the hardest book they had ever worked on. And it was wildly successful, in both book awards and great sales. And more importantly, it worked. I heard from many, many, many people that the resources in that book helped them feel more connected to nature. As Shaner Sensei has shared, I've gone on to write a number of other books, have several more in print, and this my writing now is what supports me full time. Recognizing Tenshoku, an experience of our motto. One day, a number of years ago, after a hard week, I was meditating on gratitude, not for a session, but for several days, 24/7. And after several days of sitting in a constant reflection on gratitude, sitting in a traffic light at 11 o'clock at night, driving to the grocery store, I had what I could only describe as a higatsuku of our motto. I recognized it as a statement of purpose, which is a little silly to say since the motto says that it's a statement of purpose. But again, I'm a little slow on the uptake. And I also recognized it as a statement of my purpose. An experience for the first time, a universal mind that loves and protects all creation and helps all things to grow and develop. Recognizing Tenshoku, a return to wildlife tracking. After having taken a break following graduate school, I reconnected with my tracking mentor, who was now explicitly teaching mentoring for nature connection and tools of what he called inner tracking. I published a guide to animal tracks, founded the Minnesota Wildlife Tracking Project, got certified in wildlife tracking, and began a long journey toward becoming a tracking evaluator myself. Recognizing Tenshoku, the common thread becomes clear. So what I was doing was running a dojo, running a wildlife tracking club, writing nature guidebooks, teaching at the university, and on the side, I had a life coaching business, coaching executives, artists, and entrepreneurs. To me, it felt like I was basically doing one thing, and that one thing finally came into focus. I was practicing and sharing principles of connection. Connection with self, connection with others, connection with nature. And I see we're running down on time, and I'd like to just wrap up by sharing with you some of the tools that I've been using through all of this to help me recognize and clarify this sense of Tenshoku. This picture is the fabulous Rose Aerosmith-Deku. Rose is someone I met through my training at Landmark Education. She was a fellow program leader there. She helped me get my life coaching business up and running and became a writing buddy. She is the First Lady of Grand Marais, a storyteller and young adult author. And we have had weekly calls checking in about writing projects and other things that we've been up to for about the last 8 years. At the beginning of every call, we start with 2 questions. We ask each other, what's something you're feeling grateful for today? And we ask each other, what are you up to with your life? And then we sit and listen. So for the last 8 years, I've had someone ask me every single week, what am I doing with my life? And then wait for me to stammer out the answer. Sometimes it comes out quickly. Sometimes it takes 20 minutes. And she listens and gives me space for it to land. I picked up a practice from my tracking mentor of doing an annual retreat at the end of the year and applying the tools that he calls inner tracking to reflect on the past year, reflect on Tenshoku, my sense of purpose, and to create the year ahead. And I ongoingly practice setting and fulfilling on intentions, right? Back to that very first lesson of what is training, intention and attention. Setting a sense of purpose, and then paying attention to what happens. And finally, I've been focusing on nurturing curiosity, both in myself and others. And I'll just put this up here. This is the long form version of my Tenshoku, what I shared at the very beginning, and then how I go about expressing that in my life today. And with that, Rich, I'd like to turn it back over to you. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was wonderful, John. Thank you. If you want to take down your share, perfect. What I'm going to do, I'm looking at the chat section. I don't see any questions written down, but that has never stopped anyone from going live mic. If there's anyone that does have a question, we have a couple minutes before I want to hand it back over to Shaner Sensei.
So, Rich, I'm seeing one comment here that I'll just riff off of for 30 seconds. The spider. When I was a preteen, I had recurring nightmares about spiders. It took me a long time to make friends with the spider family. We get along pretty well these days. Interestingly, I learned many, many years later that in some native traditions, the spider is seen as a symbol of a mass communicator, and that it's common for writers to have a strong connection to spiders. So it started as a phobia, ended up becoming my career. And I have a very strong affinity for the spider family these days, and a lot of gratitude for them.
Wow.
Thank you, John. So Shaner Sensei, we have a few minutes left. When I hand it back to you, you can tease up next week.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand. Poppele Sensei, just so you know, we have 2 tarantulas at my house. I recently saw some charges for $2.41 at Petco on my MasterCard, and I learned that was for crickets for the spiders. But I wanted to ask you, and I've asked you this before, how did you deal with your unconventional life and people asking you, so what do you do? And you start off without having finished high school, and then you become a college professor, and you relax into discovering yourself. Along the way, how did you deal with your ego when people asked you, what do you do?
You know, I wish I had a clear answer to that. You know, I guess really honestly, I spent so much of my life from my teens through my 30s just trying to get rid of the pain that I didn't care very much about what other people thought of me. And by the time I finally found practices that left me feeling connected, it didn't matter so much.
Thank
Beautiful.
you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Am I unmuted? Yeah. John, as always, thank you for your incredible preparation, but also your authenticity and your willingness to share, as you always do. You know, maybe the highest compliment I can give someone in this field is all your students absolutely adore you. You know, there's no place to hide with your students. And to me, that's just a huge compliment. Toi Sensei always said that students are a reflection of the teacher, and they are. And you've been a really wonderful teacher. So thank you. My, didn't think I'd get all teary about it, but you're amazing. Just the way you are. Next Thursday, we are going to have a treat. Nathan Patton, who's an educator, a professional school teacher and administrator and consultant, and a longtime Aikido practitioner. He will be leading the session next Thursday. And the title that he has selected is very short, simple, and makes you think. It goes like this: we're one, but we're not all the same. That's his title. And his description is even more pithy. He says, we'll discuss the radical humility required to know your partner's mind. Radical humility. From Nathan Patton. That's incredible. All right, John, thank you so much. I look out there and I'm so flattered. You know, each time I see your faces, I know where you're from. I'm paying attention that you're here, not just waiting for the recording to come out. And I just really appreciate that engagement. You guys are just terrific. So many different time zones. Continue to write to me. Dan Atwater, you always write like super long letters, like 30 minutes before we go on. So as soon as we hang up, I'll respond to your lengthy email. But just looking around, thank you so much. Our friends in Europe, you guys, Olaf, Sophia, Crystal, I'm looking at you now. I feel honored that you're with us. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.